In the autumn of 1956, archaeologists from the University of Charleston made an unexpected discovery while excavating the grounds of what had once been Whitmore Plantation, located 37 miles southwest of Charleston in the Low Country region. What they found beneath the collapsed ruins of the main house would lead to one of the most carefully concealed family secrets in antebellum Southern history. The plantation had belonged to the Whitmore family from 1822 until 1865, when Union forces burned most of the structures during their march through South Carolina. For nearly a century, the land had remained abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the marshy wilderness characteristic of the region. Local residents in nearby Beaufort County had long avoided the area, claiming the place carried an unnatural silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Dr. Margaret Hensley, the lead archaeologist on the excavation, initially expected to find the typical remnants of plantation life: broken pottery, rusted farm implements, perhaps the foundations of slave quarters. Instead, her team uncovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Hidden beneath what appeared to be the kitchen foundation, they found a sealed chamber containing dozens of personal journals, all written in the same careful handwriting. The journals belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, wife of plantation owner Thomas Whitmore. The earliest entries dated back to 1828, just 6 years after the family had established their cotton operation. The final entry was dated March 15th, 1864, 1 year before the plantation's destruction. What made these journals extraordinary was not their age, but their contents. Eleanor Whitmore had documented, in excruciating detail, 4 decades of secrets that the family had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. From the 100 most common names in South Carolina during the 1800s, we know that Eleanor's full name was Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, née Caldwell. She had been born in 1807 to a prosperous Charleston merchant family. Her marriage to Thomas Whitmore in 1825 had been considered advantageous for both families, joining coastal merchant wealth with inland agricultural prosperity. The initial entries in Eleanor's journals painted the picture of a typical plantation mistress adjusting to rural life. She wrote about managing household staff, organizing social gatherings for neighboring plantation families, and the daily routines of overseeing a large domestic operation. Her handwriting in these early entries was confident and flowing, suggesting a woman comfortable with her position and circumstances. However, by 1831, a subtle change appeared in both her writing style and the nature of her entries. The careful penmanship became more hurried, and she began making cryptic references to the room beneath and Thomas's collection. These mentions were scattered among otherwise mundane observations about weather, crop yields, and social calls, as if she were deliberately hiding significant information within everyday details. The Whitmore plantation encompassed nearly 3,000 acres along the Ashley River, with the main house situated on a slight rise overlooking the rice fields that provided much of the family's wealth. The house itself had been built in the Georgian style popular among wealthy South Carolina planters, with a wide front porch supported by 6 massive columns. What visitors could not have known was that Thomas Whitmore had commissioned a series of modifications to the original architectural plans, additions that would not become apparent until much later. Eleanor's journals from 1832 contained the first direct reference to what she called the arrangement. She wrote, "Thomas has explained the necessity of the arrangement to me, though I confess I do not fully understand his reasoning. He says it is a matter of maintaining proper order, but the sounds that carry up through the floorboards at night suggest something far different from order." The entry was followed by several pages that had been carefully torn out, leaving only ragged edges as evidence of their existence. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout the journals. Detailed descriptions followed by missing pages, as if Eleanor had second-guessed her own documentation and attempted to destroy the most incriminating evidence. Local records from Beaufort County Courthouse, examined years after the archaeological discovery, revealed that the Whitmore plantation had an unusually high turnover rate among both enslaved workers and hired staff. Between 1830 and 1860, more than 200 individuals were recorded as having worked on the plantation for periods of less than 6 months. This was highly unusual for the region, where plantation workers typically remained in the same location for years or even decades. More troubling were the informal reports that appeared in the Charleston Mercury between 1835 and 1845. These brief mentions, usually buried in the back pages among shipping reports and agricultural notices, referenced unexplained departures and sudden relocations of workers from various low-country plantations. A disproportionate number of these reports mentioned the Whitmore plantation specifically, though always in vague terms that suggested the newspaper editors were reluctant to investigate further. Eleanor's writing during this period became increasingly fragmented and coded. She developed a system of symbols and abbreviations that appeared nowhere else in 19th-century plantation records. Modern linguists who studied the journals in the 1960s determined that she had created an entirely personal cipher, mixing English, French phrases, and mathematical notations to disguise the true meaning of her most sensitive observations. One entry from 1836, partially decoded by researchers, read, "The count has reached 17. T says they are willing participants, but their expressions suggest otherwise. I have taken to wearing cotton in my ears during the evening hours. The arrangement continues below, while we maintain appearances above." The reference to 17 appeared to correlate with plantation records, showing 17 workers who had been reported as relocated to other properties during the same time period. However, no corresponding records existed at any neighboring plantations, indicating that these workers had actually arrived at new locations. They had simply vanished from all official documentation. Dr. Hensley's archaeological team found additional evidence that supported Eleanor's cryptic observations. Beneath the main house, they discovered a network of rooms that had been carefully concealed during the original construction. These spaces were accessible only through a hidden entrance located behind what appeared to be a standard root cellar. The rooms themselves showed signs of long-term habitation, with primitive sleeping areas, water storage systems, and ventilation shafts that had been ingeniously disguised as foundation supports. More disturbing were the personal items found scattered throughout these hidden chambers. Clothing, shoes, eating utensils, and personal effects from dozens of different individuals had been left behind, as if their owners had departed suddenly without time to collect their belongings. Carbon dating of fabric samples confirmed that these items dated from the 1830s through the 1860s, exactly matching the time frame covered in Eleanor's journals. The most significant discovery was a series of wooden boards that had been nailed over what appeared to be additional chambers extending even deeper underground. Carved into these boards were dozens of names, dates, and brief messages. Some were scratched hastily, as if made in desperation. Others showed careful workmanship, suggesting the writers had sufficient time to create lasting records. All of the messages shared certain characteristics. They contained first names only, they included references to families in distant states, and they expressed hope for eventual reunion with loved ones. Eleanor's journals from 1840 through 1845 revealed her growing awareness of the full scope of what she called Thomas's enterprise. Now her entries became longer and more detailed, suggesting that she had overcome her initial reluctance to document what she was witnessing. She wrote, "I have come to understand that the arrangement is not temporary, as Thomas initially claimed. The rooms below have become permanent residences for individuals who believe themselves to be in transition to other employment. Some have been here for more than 2 years. The word employment appeared throughout Eleanor's later writings, always in context that suggested it was a euphemism for something far more sinister. Cross-referencing her entries with surviving business correspondence from Thomas Whitmore revealed a complex network of arrangements with plantation owners throughout Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. These letters, written in the careful legal language typical of business dealings, discussed specialized labor arrangements and discreet relocation services. What emerged from this correspondence was evidence of an operation that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Whitmore plantation. Thomas Whitmore appeared to be operating a sophisticated system for redirecting human beings away from their intended destinations. Workers who believed they were being transferred to new employment would arrive at Whitmore Plantation only to disappear into the hidden chambers beneath the main house. Meanwhile, Thomas collected payments from multiple sources. The original plantations for accepting the transferred workers, the receiving plantations for providing workers who never actually arrived, and additional fees for what his correspondence described as specialized services. Eleanor's awareness of these financial arrangements seemed to coincide with a dramatic change in her own behavior. Neighbors began to notice that she rarely left the plantation grounds, declined most social invitations, and appeared increasingly withdrawn during the few public appearances she did make. The wife of a neighboring planter wrote in her own diary, "Eleanor Whitmore has become quite strange in recent months. During our last visit, she started several times at sounds the rest of us could not hear, and she kept referring to voices coming from beneath the floor." Thomas explained that she had been suffering from nervous complaints, but her behavior seemed less like illness and more like fear. The hidden chambers beneath the Whitmore house provided evidence that Eleanor's fear was entirely justified. Dr. Ensley's team found scratch marks on the wooden walls that appeared to form crude calendars, suggesting that occupants had attempted to track the passage of time during extended periods of confinement. Food storage areas showed signs of careful rationing, indicating that meals had been provided in limited quantities. Most telling were the primitive workshops scattered throughout the chambers, where occupants had clearly been required to perform various types of labor while remaining hidden from the outside world. Textile fragments found in these workshops matched samples of cloth that appeared in Charleston markets during the 1840s and 50s, suggesting that the hidden workers had been producing goods for commercial sale. Other workshops contained woodworking tools, metalworking equipment, and facilities for food processing. The scale and organization of these operations indicated that Thomas Whitmore had been operating what amounted to an underground factory powered by workers who had been effectively removed from all official records. Eleanor's journals from 1847 contained her most explicit description of the system's operation. A new group arrived yesterday, believing they were being transported to a plantation in Georgia. Thomas met them at the river landing and provided them with a meal and temporary quarters in the main house. During the night, while they slept, he moved them to the chambers below. When they awakened, he explained that there had been a change in arrangements and that they would need to remain at Whitmore Plantation for a brief period while new transportation was organized. That was 3 days ago. They continue to wait for transportation that will never arrive. The entry continued, "I have observed this pattern repeatedly. The new arrivals are always told that their stay will be temporary. They are provided with work to keep them occupied while they wait. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Eventually, they stop asking about transportation and accept their situation. Thomas provides them with basic necessities and maintains the fiction that they are temporary guests rather than permanent residents. The arrangement benefits everyone, he claims, except that no one outside these walls knows where they are. Local church records from the 1840s revealed another troubling pattern that supported Eleanor's observations. Multiple parishes throughout the Low Country reported receiving inquiries from families searching for missing relatives who had last been seen travelling toward employment opportunities in the Charleston area. These inquiries typically described individuals who had left their home communities with promises of work at specific plantations, only to disappear entirely before reaching their stated destinations. The Reverend Samuel Morrison of St. Andrew's Parish documented several of these cases in his official correspondence with church authorities. In one letter dated 1849, he wrote, "The families continue to arrive seeking information about their missing members. They carry letters promising employment and provide detailed descriptions of the arrangements that were made. However, when I make inquiries at the plantations mentioned in these letters, I am told that no such individuals ever arrived. The families are convinced that their relatives must be located somewhere in the region, but all official channels report no knowledge of their whereabouts." Eleanor's growing understanding of her husband's operation coincided with what appeared to be her own transformation from reluctant observer to active participant. Her journal entries from 1850 onward showed detailed knowledge of the logistics involved in maintaining the hidden population beneath their house. She wrote extensively about food storage, work scheduling, health care, and even the complex system Thomas had developed for managing personal conflicts among the confined workers. The most chilling aspect of Eleanor's later entries was her matter-of-fact tone when describing what had become her daily routine. She wrote, "Tuesday I distributed the weekly clothing allowances and collected the completed textile work for transport to Charleston. Wednesday, I treated a worker who had injured his hand in the woodworking area and made arrangements for additional medical supplies. Thursday, I interviewed 3 new arrivals to determine their skills and assign them to appropriate work areas. The arrangement has become quite efficient." This transformation from horrified observer to administrative participant suggested that Eleanor had gradually adapted to circumstances that would have been unthinkable to her during her early years of marriage. Psychological studies conducted in the 1960s on individuals who had survived similar situations of prolonged confinement identified this adaptation as a common survival mechanism. However, Eleanor's case was unique because she had maintained the freedom to leave while choosing to remain and participate in the system that held others captive. Hensley's archaeological team found evidence that the hidden chambers had been continuously occupied for more than 30 years. Carbon dating of organic materials showed consistent human habitation from the 1830s through the early 1860s, with the most recent materials dating from 1863. This suggested that Thomas Whitmore had continued operating his system almost until the arrival of Union forces in the area. The final entries in Eleanor's journals, written during 1863 and 1864, revealed her growing anxiety about the approaching end of the war and the potential discovery of the chambers beneath their house. She wrote, "Thomas has become increasingly agitated about the reports of Union advances in Virginia. He speaks of the need to finalize arrangements before external circumstances force changes to our situation. I have urged him to consider releasing the current residents, but he insists that such action would create risks that cannot be managed." The entry dated March 10, 1864, just 5 days before the final entry in her journals, provided the most direct description of Thomas's ultimate solution to the approaching crisis. Thomas has made his decision regarding the arrangement. He says that the residents below cannot be permitted to carry tales to the authorities when the war ends. He has convinced them that Union forces will treat them as escaped criminals and that their only safety lies in remaining hidden. Most have accepted this explanation, but several of the longer-term residents have begun to express doubts. Eleanor's final journal entry, written on March 15, 1864, consisted of only 3 sentences. Thomas completed his preparations last night. The chambers below are now silent. I pray that God will forgive us both for what we have become. No further entries appeared in any of Eleanor's journals, despite the fact that she and Thomas continued to live at the plantation for nearly another year before its destruction. When Union forces arrived in March 1865, they found Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore living alone in the main house, with no evidence of any workers or staff on the property. Both claimed that all of their workers had fled months earlier, when news of the Union advance reached the area. Contemporary Union Army reports described the Whitmores as cooperative and apparently truthful in their statements about the abandoned condition of their plantation. Colonel James Peterson of the Massachusetts 54th Infantry noted in his official report, "The plantation owners appeared genuinely relieved by our arrival and expressed gratitude that the war was nearly ended." They provided detailed accounts of the hardships they had endured during the final months of the conflict, and seemed eager to comply with new federal requirements for the treatment of former enslaved workers. Dodelit, the Whitmores relocated to Charleston after the destruction of their plantation and lived quietly there until Thomas's death in 1872 and Eleanor's death in 1878. Neither ever remarked publicly about their experiences during the war years. Eleanor's obituary in the Charleston News and Courier described her as a devoted wife who had endured the hardships of war with remarkable strength and dignity. Dr. Hensley's archaeological team conducted extensive excavations of the chamber system throughout 1957 and 1958. In addition to the personal effects and workshop areas, they discovered what appeared to be a series of sealed chambers that had been deliberately filled with soil and debris sometime during 1864. The process of excavating these areas required careful work to preserve any evidence that might remain. What they found confirmed the implications of Eleanor's final journal entries. The sealed chambers contained the remains of 43 individuals, arranged in a manner that suggested they had been positioned deliberately rather than having died from natural causes. Carbon dating confirmed that all of the remains dated from 1864, corresponding exactly with the time frame of Eleanor's final journal entries. More disturbing was the evidence that the sealing of these chambers had been accomplished with considerable planning and preparation. The soil and debris used to fill the spaces had been transported from other areas of the plantation, and the work had been completed in a way that left the upper chambers accessible for continued use. This suggested that Thomas Whitmore had eliminated the long-term residents while maintaining the facility for potential future operations. Personal effects found with the remains provided additional confirmation of Eleanor's accounts. Many of the individuals had been carrying letters, documents, or personal items that matched descriptions in missing person reports filed with various county authorities during the 1830s and 1840s. These items allowed researchers to identify several of the victims and trace their original destinations, confirming that they had indeed been redirected to the Whitmore plantation while traveling to legitimate employment opportunities. The discovery of Eleanor's journals and the archaeological evidence beneath Whitmore plantation prompted a broader investigation into similar operations that might have existed throughout the antebellum South. Researchers from multiple universities collaborated on a project that examined courthouse records, newspaper archives, and family documents from across the region. Their findings, published in 1962, suggested that the Whitmore operation had been part of a larger network of illegal labor trafficking that had operated throughout the Southeast during the decades before the Civil War. However, the Whitmore case remained unique due to the detailed documentation provided by Eleanor's journals. No other similar operation had left such extensive written records, and no other site had preserved such complete archaeological evidence. Dr. Hensley noted in her final report, "The Whitmore discovery provides the only comprehensive view we have of how such operations functioned on a day-to-day basis." Eleanor's journals reveal not just the mechanical details of the system, but the psychological processes that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. The journals also revealed the gradual process by which Eleanor had transformed from an unwilling witness to an active participant in her husband's enterprise. Early entries showed genuine distress and moral confusion about what she was observing. Later entries demonstrated a systematic rationalization of the system, and eventually a complete acceptance of her role within it. This progression provided psychologists and historians with valuable insights into how individuals adapt to participating in systems of organized cruelty. Dr. Robert Chen, a psychologist who studied Eleanor's journals as part of his research into moral adaptation, noted, "The Whitmore case demonstrates how gradual exposure to morally compromising situations can lead to complete ethical transformation." Eleanor began as someone who was clearly troubled by what she witnessed. Over time, she developed justifications that allowed her to not only accept the situation, but to take pride in her administrative efficiency within the system. The journals also provided evidence of the sophisticated methods Thomas Whitmore had developed to maintain his operation without detection. His correspondence with other plantation owners was carefully crafted to avoid explicit descriptions of illegal activities, while still communicating the essential details of business arrangements. His treatment of the confined workers was designed to maintain their cooperation through a combination of false hope and practical necessities. Most importantly, his cultivation of a reputation as a respectable plantation owner provided him with social protection that made investigation unlikely. Local residents who had known the Whitmores during the plantation years were interviewed extensively during the 1950s and early 1960s. Their recollections painted a picture of a couple who had maintained careful public appearances while hiding the reality of their private activities. Margaret Sinclair, whose family had owned a neighboring plantation, recalled, "Thomas and Eleanor always seemed perfectly normal when they attended social gatherings. Eleanor was perhaps a bit quieter than other plantation wives, but nothing that would have suggested anything unusual. Thomas was known for his business acumen and was often consulted by other planters for advice on agricultural matters." These interviews revealed how effectively the Whitmores had maintained their deception. None of their neighbors reported having seen any evidence of the hidden workers, despite the fact that the operation had continued for more than 30 years. The concealment had been so complete that even people who knew them well had no suspicion that anything unusual was occurring at the plantation. The physical evidence discovered by Dr. Hensley's team also demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the concealment system. The hidden chambers had been designed with multiple ventilation shafts that were disguised as normal foundation elements. Food storage areas were accessible through passages that appeared to be standard root cellars. Waste management systems had been integrated into the plantation's existing infrastructure in ways that left no visible evidence of the additional population living beneath the main house. Most remarkably, the workshop areas had been designed to operate without producing sounds that would be detectable from outside the chamber system. Textile work was conducted using tools that had been modified to operate more quietly than standard equipment. Woodworking areas included sound-dampening materials that had been incorporated into the chamber walls. Even food preparation areas had been designed to minimize the sounds and odors that might reveal their existence to people in the upper levels of the house. Eleanor's journals provided detailed descriptions of the daily schedules that had been implemented to coordinate the activities of dozens of people living in concealed spaces. Work assignments were carefully planned to avoid conflicts over access to tools and work areas. Meal schedules were designed to ensure that food preparation could be completed efficiently while maintaining noise discipline. Even personal activities like conversation and recreation were regulated to prevent sounds that might carry to the upper levels of the house. The psychological impact of these living conditions on the confined workers became apparent through the personal messages that had been carved into the chamber walls. Many expressed hope for eventual release and reunion with family members. Others documented the gradual acceptance of their situation and adaptation to permanent confinement. The most disturbing messages suggested that some individuals had come to identify with their captors and had accepted explanations that justified their continued confinement. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a sociologist who specialized in studying communities under extreme stress, analyzed these messages as part of her research into survival mechanisms in isolated populations. She noted, the progression of messages over time shows a clear pattern of adaptation to circumstances that would initially have been unbearable. The individuals who left these messages had developed social structures, work relationships, and even recreational activities that allowed them to maintain psychological stability despite their physical confinement. The discovery of Eleanor's journals and the archaeological evidence at Whitmore Plantation had profound implications for understanding the social history of the antebellum South. Previous historical research had focused primarily on the experiences of enslaved workers on traditional plantations, but the Whitmore case revealed a category of exploitation that had been hidden from historical view. The individuals who had been confined in the chambers beneath the Whitmore house had been legally free, but had been effectively enslaved through deception and physical confinement. This distinction was significant because it demonstrated that systems of forced labor had continued to operate outside the legal framework of slavery, affecting individuals who should have been protected by their legal status as free workers. The Whitmore operation had exploited the isolation and limited communication systems of the antebellum period to create a form of captivity that was invisible to legal and social authorities. Dr. Hensley's final report, submitted to the University of Charleston in 1959, concluded, "The Whitmore Plantation site represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to antebellum labor systems. The physical evidence, combined with Eleanor Whitmore's detailed documentation, provides an unprecedented view of an operation that existed entirely outside normal social and legal frameworks. The case demonstrates the extent to which exploitation could be concealed when geographic isolation was combined with careful planning and social respectability." The journals and archaeological findings were eventually donated to the South Carolina Historical Society, where they remained available for research until 1968, when they were transferred to climate-controlled storage facilities, and access was limited to approved researchers. The site of the former Whitmore Plantation was designated as a historical landmark, though the specific details of its history were not included in public documentation. Local residents continued to avoid the area even after the archaeological work was completed. The silence that had long characterized the former plantation grounds seemed to intensify rather than diminish after the chambers beneath the main house were excavated and documented. Visitors to the site frequently reported a sense of unease that made prolonged stays uncomfortable, though no rational explanation could be provided for these feelings. In 1963, a graduate student named Michael Thompson attempted to conduct a follow-up study of the site as part of his doctoral research in American history. His work was intended to focus on the economic aspects of the Whitmore operation and its relationship to broader patterns of labor exploitation in the antebellum South. However, Thompson's research was cut short when he reported experiencing what he described as auditory disturbances that made it difficult for him to concentrate while working at the site. Thompson's notes, preserved in the University of Charleston archives, described these disturbances as voices carrying up from below ground level, always just at the edge of audibility. Archaeological. He noted that the sounds were most noticeable during late afternoon and early evening hours, and that they seemed to increase in intensity when he attempted to work near the areas where the hidden chambers had been located. Medical examination revealed no hearing abnormalities that could account for these experiences. The Thompson case led university authorities to restrict access to the site and limit future research projects to daylight hours with mandatory supervision. No subsequent researchers reported similar auditory experiences, though several noted that the site retained an atmosphere of unease that made concentrated work difficult. The area was eventually declared unsuitable for ongoing archaeological research and was returned to its previous state of abandonment. Eleanor's journals, meanwhile, continued to provide material for scholarly research into the psychological and social dynamics of complicity in systems of organized cruelty. Her detailed documentation of her own transformation from reluctant observer to active participant became a primary source for studies of moral adaptation under extreme circumstances. Universities throughout the United States included excerpts from her writings in courses on psychology, sociology, and American history. However, the journals also raised troubling questions about the extent to which similar operations might have existed throughout the South during the antebellum period. Eleanor's references to Thomas's correspondence with other plantation owners suggested that the Whitmore operation had been part of a broader network rather than an isolated case. Efforts to trace these connections through surviving business records and personal correspondence yielded fragmentary evidence of similar arrangements, but nothing approaching the comprehensive documentation provided by Eleanor's journals. The implications of these findings remained a subject of scholarly debate well into the 1960s. Some historians argued that the Whitmore case represented an extreme anomaly that should not be used to draw broader conclusions about antebellum labor practices. Others maintained that the case revealed a pattern of exploitation that had been systematically concealed from historical view, and that similar operations had likely existed throughout the region. Dr. Patricia Williams, who conducted extensive research into antebellum labor records during the early 1960s, noted, "The Whitmore discovery forces us to reconsider our assumptions about the scope and nature of labor exploitation during this period. If such an extensive operation could remain completely hidden from contemporary authorities and historical researchers for nearly a century, we must ask what other systems of exploitation remain undiscovered in the historical record." The question of how many people had been affected by the Whitmore operation and similar systems remained unanswered despite extensive research efforts. Eleanor's journals provided evidence for at least 200 individuals who had passed through the plantation over a 30-year period, but the archaeological evidence suggested that the actual numbers might have been significantly higher. The systematic destruction of evidence that had preceded the end of the war made it impossible to develop precise counts of the people who had been affected. More disturbing was the evidence suggesting that knowledge of such operations had been more widespread than previously understood. Eleanor's journals contained references to visitors who had seen the hidden chambers and had participated in discussions about the management of confined workers. These references suggested that a network of individuals had been aware of the Whitmore operation and had either participated in similar activities or had provided various forms of support and assistance. The social implications of this broader complicity became a focus of research during the civil rights era, as scholars attempted to understand how systems of systematic exploitation had been maintained through community silence and collective denial. The Whitmore case provided a historical example of how ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary cruelty through gradual adaptation and rationalization of initially unthinkable circumstances. Eleanor's journals documented not only her own transformation, but also the similar adaptations that had occurred among other people who had become aware of the plantation's hidden activities. Her descriptions of social gatherings attended by individuals who knew about the chambers revealed how knowledge of systematic exploitation could become normalized within social networks that shared common interests in maintaining profitable but illegal operations. The psychological mechanisms that had enabled this widespread complicity became subjects of study for researchers interested in understanding how communities adapt to the presence of systematic cruelty. Eleanor's detailed observations provided insights into the rationalization processes that allowed people to maintain normal social relationships while participating in or ignoring systems that caused severe harm to others. Dr. James Patterson, whose research into community responses to organized violence was influenced by the Whitmore case, noted, Eleanor's journals reveal how individuals and communities develop shared explanations that allow them to participate in or tolerate activities that would normally provoke moral outrage. The process of collective rationalization creates social environments where extraordinary cruelty can become ordinary routine. The long-term impact of the Whitmore discovery extended beyond academic research into broader discussions about historical memory and the preservation of difficult truths. The decision to limit public access to Eleanor's journals and to restrict detailed information about the archaeological findings reflected ongoing debates about how societies should remember and commemorate historical atrocities that had been hidden from public view. Some argued that full disclosure of the details contained in Eleanor's journals would serve important educational purposes by documenting the extent to which systematic cruelty had been concealed within seemingly respectable communities. Others maintained that such disclosure could cause unnecessary distress to descendants of both victims and perpetrators without providing corresponding benefits for historical understanding. These debates continued throughout the 1960s as civil rights activists and historians pressed for fuller disclosure of historical records related to exploitation and violence in the antebellum South. The Whitmore case became a focal point for discussions about the responsibilities of historians and institutions to preserve and share difficult truths about the past, even when such truths challenged comfortable narratives about historical communities and their moral character. By 1969, interest in the Whitmore case had begun to fade as researchers turned their attention to other aspects of antebellum history and contemporary social issues. The journals remained in restricted archives, accessible only to approved scholars, and the site of the former plantation returned to its previous state of abandonment. The silence that had always characterized the area seemed to deepen rather than diminish as the years passed. Local residents continued to avoid the former plantation grounds, though the specific reasons for their reluctance became less clear as memories of the archaeological discoveries faded from immediate community consciousness. The area acquired a reputation for being somehow unwelcoming to human presence, though few people could articulate exactly why they found it uncomfortable to visit or work there. The stories that persisted in local oral tradition focused less on the historical facts that had been documented by Eleanor's journals and more on vague impressions of unease that seemed to emanate from the land itself. These stories typically described the area as a place where sounds carried differently than they should, where silence seemed too complete, and where even brief visits left people feeling emotionally drained and anxious to leave. Whether these persistent impressions reflected genuine environmental factors related to the site's history or simply represented the psychological impact of knowledge about past events remained a subject of occasional discussion among local residents. However, the practical result was that the former Whitmore plantation remained largely undisturbed, slowly returning to the natural state that had begun to reclaim it before the archaeological discoveries of the 1950s. The final chapter in the immediate aftermath of the Whitmore discovery occurred in early 1969, when the South Carolina Historical Society completed the transfer of all materials related to the case to federal archives in Washington, D.C. This transfer was conducted quietly, without public announcement, and resulted in even more restricted access to Eleanor's journals and the archaeological findings. The official justification for this transfer cited the need for specialized preservation facilities and expert archival management. However, some observers noted that the transfer effectively removed the materials from easy access by regional researchers and community members who might have had personal interests in the case. The practical result was that detailed knowledge of the Whitmore operation became even more limited and specialized than it had been when the materials were held at the state level. Dr. Hensley, who had led the original archaeological investigation, noted in her final report on the case, "The Whitmore plantation discovery provides crucial insights into hidden aspects of antebellum social and economic systems. However, the full implications of these findings may not be understood for many years, as researchers continue to examine the evidence and place it within broader historical contexts." The case demonstrates both the importance of archaeological investigation in revealing hidden histories and the challenges involved in interpreting evidence of systematic cruelty that was deliberately concealed from contemporary view. The site itself was eventually purchased by a timber company that planned to harvest the trees that had grown up around the former plantation buildings during the century since their destruction. However, workers reported difficulties maintaining equipment at the site, citing mechanical problems that occurred with unusual frequency when operating in the areas where the main house and hidden chambers had been located. The timber harvest was completed in 1970, but the company subsequently sold the land rather than developing it for other commercial purposes. Today, the former Whitmore plantation exists as several hundred acres of wetland and second-growth forest, indistinguishable from countless other abandoned agricultural sites throughout the South Carolina Lowcountry. No markers indicate the location or acknowledge the history that was documented there during the 1950s archaeological investigation. The land remains privately owned and largely inaccessible to casual visitors, though hunters and fishermen occasionally use the area during appropriate seasons. The silence that Eleanor Whitmore documented in her journals continues to characterize the area, though whether this silence reflects natural environmental factors or the persistent impact of historical events remains a matter of individual interpretation. Those who do visit the site often report that sounds seem to be absorbed rather than echoing naturally, and that conversation becomes difficult to maintain despite the absence of any obvious environmental factors that would interfere with normal communication. Perhaps most significantly, the area seems to resist efforts at documentation or record-keeping that extend beyond brief visits. Photographers report frequent equipment malfunctions that occur nowhere else. Researchers attempting to conduct follow-up studies find that their notes and recordings often contain gaps or distortions that make comprehensive documentation difficult. Even casual visitors tend to have trouble remembering specific details about their experiences at the site, though they typically retain clear impressions of unease and a desire to leave. The legacy of Eleanor Whitmore's journals and the archaeological discoveries at the plantation continue to influence historical research and psychological studies, though access to the primary source materials remains limited to a small number of approved scholars. The case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of how systematic cruelty can be concealed within seemingly respectable communities, and how ordinary individuals can gradually adapt to participating in extraordinary systems of exploitation. More broadly, the Whitmore case serves as a reminder that historical records may preserve only limited aspects of past realities, and that the most significant events in human experience may be precisely those that were most carefully hidden from contemporary documentation. The silence that surrounded the plantation during its years of operation has been replaced by a different kind of silence. The quiet of academic archives, where Eleanor's detailed confession waits for researchers who may never fully understand the implications of what she documented with such careful precision. And in the South Carolina Lowcountry, where the Ashley River continues to flow past the spot where the Whitmore plantation once stood, the land itself maintains its own form of testimony. Whether through natural processes or historical memory, the area continues to resist human presence and activity, as if the very soil retains some impression of the secrets it was forced to conceal for so many years. The true scope of what Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore accomplished during 4 decades of deception may never be fully understood, but the consequences of their actions continue to resonate through the landscape they left behind. The final researcher to examine Eleanor's journals before their transfer to federal archives was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian specializing in antebellum women's experiences. In 1968, she was granted access to complete the last comprehensive analysis of the materials. Her findings, published in a restricted academic journal, revealed one last disturbing detail that previous researchers had overlooked. Hidden within Eleanor's final entries, written in her coded system of symbols and abbreviations, was a confession that went beyond her documented participation in her husband's operation. Dr. Mitchell's decoding revealed that Eleanor had not merely adapted to the system, she had eventually taken control of it. The coded entries from 1862 and 1863 indicated that Thomas Whitmore had begun suffering from what appeared to be early-stage dementia, gradually losing his ability to manage the complex logistics of the hidden chambers. Eleanor had quietly assumed responsibility for all aspects of the operation, making the decisions that determined the fate of the confined workers. The systematic elimination that preceded the end of the war had been her choice, not her husband's. More chilling was Eleanor's analysis of her own transformation, written in the careful script that had characterized her earliest journal entries. "I have become something I could never have imagined when I first arrived at this place. The woman who once wept at the sounds from below no longer exists. In her place stands someone who understands that survival requires the elimination of all evidence." Thomas believes he made the final decision, but he has not been capable of such reasoning for months. I have allowed him to believe otherwise, as it provides comfort during his decline. Dr. Mitchell's research was completed in October 1968. Her final report, submitted to the South Carolina Historical Society, recommended that Eleanor's journals be permanently sealed due to their potential impact on descendants of both victims and perpetrators. The recommendation was accepted, and the materials were transferred to federal archives, with access restrictions that remain in effect today. The Whitmore plantation site was quietly purchased by the federal government in 1971 and designated as protected wetlands, ensuring that no future development would disturb whatever evidence might remain beneath the marshy ground. The designation included no public acknowledgement of the site's historical significance, referring only to its ecological value for migratory waterfowl. local residents gradually stopped discussing the archaeological discoveries of the 1950s. The stories that had circulated about strange sounds and uncomfortable silences became part of regional folklore, disconnected from their historical origins. Newer residents who moved to the area in later decades had no knowledge of what had been discovered there, though many independently reported feeling uneasy when traveling past the former plantation site. By the 1980s, the Whitmore case had faded from active historical research. The restricted access to primary source materials made comprehensive study impossible, and other aspects of antebellum history attracted scholarly attention. Eleanor's journals remained in federal archives, their existence known only to a small number of specialists who were prohibited from discussing their contents outside approved academic channels. The silence that had protected the Whitmore operation during its years of existence eventually extended to protect the memory of what had been discovered there. The systematic concealment that Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore had practiced so successfully during their lifetime continued long after their deaths, ensuring that the full truth of what had occurred beneath their house remained hidden from public knowledge. Today, more than 6 decades after Dr. Hensley's archaeological team first discovered Eleanor's journals, the former Whitmore plantation rests beneath the waters of a restored tidal marsh. Rising sea levels and wetland restoration projects have gradually reclaimed the area, covering the foundations and filled chambers with several feet of brackish water and marsh grass. The land has returned to a state that would have been familiar to the Whitmore family when they first arrived in 1822, before they began the modifications that would allow them to hide so much human suffering beneath their respectable facade. The Ashley River continues to flow past the submerged site, carrying the tides that now cover whatever evidence might remain of 4 decades of carefully concealed cruelty. Occasionally, hunters or fishermen working in the area report finding unusual objects in their nets or washed up along the shoreline. Pieces of old pottery, fragments of metal, scraps of fabric that seem far older than they should be in such an active waterway. These discoveries are typically discarded as debris from unknown sources, their significance unrecognized by people who have no knowledge of what lies beneath the quiet waters of the marsh. The silence that Eleanor Whitmore documented so carefully in her journals has become complete, preserved now not by human conspiracy, but by the natural processes that have reclaimed the land and buried its secrets beneath layers of sediment and time. And sometimes, on still evenings when the tide is low and the marsh grass moves in patterns that seem to follow no discernible wind, local residents report hearing what sounds like voices carrying across the water, always just at the edge of audibility, always just beyond comprehension, as if the wetlands themselves retain some echo of the 43 souls whose disappearance Eleanor recorded so meticulously in her final coded entry. But these are only stories now, disconnected from their historical origins and dismissed as the product of imagination and folklore. The truth of what Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore accomplished during 4 decades of deception rests with Eleanor's journals in restricted federal archives, where it waits for researchers who may never be granted access to read her careful documentation of how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil, one silent day at a time. The waters of the Ashley River continue their eternal flow toward the sea, carrying with them whatever secrets the marsh may still hold, while the restored wetlands serve their new purpose as habitat for the migrating birds that pass through the area each season, unaware that they rest above ground that once concealed one of the most carefully documented cases of systematic cruelty in American history.